Dutch. Do you guys agree? It's okay? I just spoke Dutch to Laura, that didn't go very well. That's really exciting actually to have a little bit of Dutch influence in this school. For me also, since I haven't been there for the longest time. And it's a real pleasure to introduce someone you already know, at least the people in the studio with Laura and Renier know. Renier de Graaf, who is the director of AMO and a partner at OMA. One of the few people actually who does both, which is quite a brave thing. He has a master's degree in architecture from Delft University and the Berlage, which is the Dutch postgraduate program. And joined OMA already in 1996. I think he's the person who has been the longest next to Rem, and that's quite an achievement, I can say that. And then they have offices in Rotterdam, New York, Beijing, Hong Kong, and Doha, and projects in over 35 countries. So that's quite a thing to deal with, and I think most of the people tend to travel those projects as well. AMO does the research and is the research and design studio established as a counterpart to OMA. And Renier has overseen AMO's increasing involvement in sustainability and energy planning, which has included ZEGA, which is a Dutch word. It's called Sea Power, a strategic master plan for the North Sea. Then they did a roadmap, 2050, a practical guide to a prosperous, low-carbon Europe with the European Climate Foundation. Actually, we saw a little bit of that in Dora's lecture last year. The Energy Report, a global plan for 100% renewable energy by 2050, made by the WWF. As a partner of OMA, he is responsible for building and master planning projects in Europe, Russia, and Middle East, including Stadskantoor and co-single mixed-use buildings in Rotterdam, the new G-Star headquarters in Amsterdam, the Commonwealth Institute and Northern Wharf mixed-use development in London. Over the last several years, Renier has worked extensively in Moscow, first by overseeing OMA's proposal to design a master plan for the Skolkovo Center for Innovation, or the Russian Silicon Valley. And in 2012, OMA and AMO led a consortium which proposed a development concept for the Moscow agglomeration, an urban plan for the greater Moscow. Since 2010, the Graaf has also been involved in founding and curriculum development for the Strelka. Strelka is a very new school in Moscow, which actually does quite interesting work. It's the Institute for Media, Architecture and Design, and Renier continues to teach as part of its postgraduate and additional program. He has recently curated 2 exhibits on hold at the British School in Rome in 2011 and a traveling exhibition, Public Works, Architecture by Civil Servants, which is part of the Biennale in 2012 and Berlin in 2013. I actually was just recently looking at a lecture he gave, I think it was at Strelka, which was Foresight in Hindsight, a history of predictions describing how the patterns of past predictions could inform us about the future. The work was initially developed in the context of a studio directed by Renier de Graaf and Laura at the Strelka Institute. And I liked the interview he had with Art Daly, where the question came up, how must society change to meet the challenges it's facing? And he answered quite interestingly, underlying in such a question is that it has to change. I think the whole notion of change is problematic because change is increasingly pursued for the sake of change itself. Change is another product of the market economy. It's what you need to sustain in a type of heightened excitement. So I think a very interesting reading, and then he further defines change as an extension of the scope of thought, of the broadening of both the mindset, the interests, but also the responsibilities that you claim. Tonight we'll discuss, does the 21st century mark the absence of utopias? And if so, what are the dangers of that? Look forward to hearing that again, and welcome.
I wasn't aware I said that, but fake it anyway. Thanks to the University of Pennsylvania, thanks to the Architecture Department for having me, thanks to Marilyn, thanks to Vinka, and also thanks to Laura, who prepared this lecture together with me. I'd like to start basically with the same image that we have started almost every single lecture with for the past 15 years, but I promise it'll be the only old image I will be showing. This is, in a way, the way we have been defining the world, or an image that, in our view, encapsulates the world as it currently is. A world no longer dominated by political ideologies, but a world most blatantly dominated by money, in which economic values are the only remaining form of a global consensus. We generally assume it started here, or definitively took off here. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989, last weekend, exactly 25 years ago. And in thinking about this event, the thoughts generally go back to here. We always assume it was the West who set the fall of the Berlin Wall in motion. We all know the famous speech of Ronald Reagan in 1987, where he called to tear down this wall, and so happened. But that's partially a misreading, but it still meant that the credit for globalization lies mostly with the proponents of the free market, those two people here. But be that as it may, I think it is important that if this image embodies a consensus, it is important to establish a consensus between who and whom. It is important to realize that this image has a flip side, and that the flip side actually seems very distant and far away today, but that doesn't mean it's any less important. This is an image also near the Berlin Wall, a couple of years earlier. Here was a state that saw the wall not as a hindrance, at least in the official propaganda, but as a form of protection against against the fascist West. And this was also a system that distinctly called itself democratic. So a kind of its own parallel version of the truth. That was a system that spanned essentially half the world's hemisphere, and where the Berlin Wall was essentially its most western outpost, and you see the leaders actually congregating here. This is a very important story to be told, because whenever we credit the Republican frontman of the West, I think it is important to give equal credit to the frontman of that system, who represented a system with its own logic and its own almost independent form of operating. The West did not set in motion the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was, prior to any of the events, an erosion or a kind of change that was sparked from within the Eastern system itself. Famous as the book Perestroika. But it's also important to know that before Reagan actually asked to tear down the wall, there was an agreement on a strategic reduction of nuclear arms, which was a far bigger factor in the rapprochement of the West and the East, and that was actually initiated by the East and initially resisted by the West. And I guess most blatantly, we must remember that the actual physical demolition of the Berlin Wall actually physically took shape by the East. It was the East who demolished this wall. So this is two versions of the same story, which actually end on the same event on the same day, November 9, 1989. Now, I have often wondered if a similar story, if a similar parallel history could be constructed for the history of architecture. You all presumably know this image very well, the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing estate in St. Louis in 1972. That image has gone down in history, thanks to Mr. James, as modern architecture coup de grace by dynamite. He locates it to the exact point in time, even to the hour and to the minute, although he doesn't seem quite sure, or thereabouts. A year earlier, a similar conclusion was drawn, and in a way a more precise conclusion was drawn, where the end of Pruitt-Igoe was the end, in a way, of thinking about the city as a makeable entity. This is the book of Colin Vancouver, Collage City, in 1976. Pruitt-Igoe acquired cult status definitively when it featured in the movie William Scuzzi, when it was dubbed over by music of Philip Glass in 1981. When we dismissed Pruitt-Igoe, what did we actually dismiss? Because, I mean, this form of history writing is simply more than about a housing estate in a city somewhere in North America. The writing of history that pinpoints Pruitt-Igoe actually dismisses the ideas of Le Corbusier about the city. It dismisses the ideas of Hilgersheimer, his famous Hochhaus Stadt in 1927. It dismisses the ideas of the Bauhaus. It dismisses the ideas of metabolism, these clusters in the air, 1967. It actually dismisses also your own Louis Kahn here, also with grandiose cities for this city that never materialized, unfortunately. It also actually dismissed Sion, but it also dismissed the revisionist movement of Sion in the form of Team 10 here in the Smithsons with their urban structuring for Berlin. It actually dismissed our own dear Jan Bakema, a modern architect, also a Team 10 member from the 1960s, who I guess is responsible for about half the built substance that is even present today in the Netherlands. So half of our country, as a result of this history writing, is also worthless. I can go on and on and on. This is kind of the more speculative futurist visions of Argism, also out of the window. Essentially, the combined textbooks and the combined body of thought of the 20th century was in a way dismissed by simply writing, by taking a news event from 1972 as a starting point. But I wonder, and I wonder in a way what other story similar to the Berlin Wall is actually hidden underneath the debris of Pruitt-Igoe. So the famous film of the demolition, I would like to play back. What really happened? Recently, a couple of years ago, an interesting documentary appeared by Chad Friedrichs, who actually tried to look in the whole thing. It focuses a lot on a number of early years, happy years, in the life of the estate before it was demolished. It interviews a great number of former residents, and it gives a very subtle and nuanced picture of the demise. I, in a way, would like to take it yet a step further and simply analyze the demolition of Pruitt-Igoe not as an architectural phenomenon, not even remotely as an architectural issue, but as a political issue, as a crossover between urbanism and politics, or where urbanism becomes political. And for that, I'd like to go back to a census map of St. Louis, made in 1930 as part of a grand plan for St. Louis, where St. Louis was actually assumed to grow larger than 1 million. But already in the pre-war years, St. Louis was one of 4 major American cities that actually had a declining population. People thought this was because of the Depression. People thought this was an anomaly in a trend which will always be up. And simply continued business as usual. But if you look at the next image, part of the City Plan Commission in 1947, you see that the trend may not be an anomaly. There's already disturbing signs. The top one is the USA, that firmly goes up. Then Illinois and Missouri mildly go up. But St. Louis is actually flattening out and slightly decreasing. And the most interesting thing is actually the bottom line, which is St. Louis Council, which in a way indicates already a very early trend of people, of urban flight, of suburbanization of Dresden, which we all know, of course, was to continue. This trend, in a way, sent a very worrying signal to the city administration. I think it was Mayor Kaufman, who I think was a Republican mayor, that commissioned a development plan for Missouri, which actually worked on the gentrification of areas immediately to the inner city. I mean, during the decline in population in the 30s, actually, the ring of neighborhoods around the city center had become increasingly populated by poor people, to the point that actually their demise started to threaten real estate prices in the center. The area in which Pruitt-Igoe is located is called the DeSoto Car neighborhood. This plan worked on the basis of gentrification and also worked on the basis of soliciting private initiatives in a way to take care of that gentrification. And this is one of the plans made by a typical developer for the DeSoto Car neighborhood. It looks suspiciously like a bit of Bechtel urbanism or Halcro urbanism that you find today, particularly in the Middle East. So this plan was made until 1949, when the federal government passed a housing act, which actually liberated on a grand scale federal funds for the provision of affordable housing nationwide. A very emphatic statement, but a statement that is almost emphatic as it is vague. It massively liberates funds for affordable housing. It doesn't really specify what form of housing, and it doesn't really specify in what part of the city that housing needs to be built. So in a strange way, this was an act that legitimized both public housing in the city centers, but also suburban developments around the cities, just as long as they were cheap. But anyway, given that Housing Act, by then St. Louis had a Democratic mayor, Mayor Joseph Darst, who actually saw in the U.S. Housing Act an opportunity to revert St. Louis' trend of population loss and to put St. Louis back on the map. This was a plan that was commissioned subsequently, the Bartholomew Plan, which really envisions the center of St. Louis as a high-rise center, but which also is even more ambitious than in terms of population growth than pre-war plans have been. I mean, the desire to take the Housing Act as the wind in the sails of the city is probably best expressed in this quote. Mayor Darst talking to the city council and actually embracing the whole notion of high-rise in the what will take Manhattan, really seizing the Housing Act as a momentum to bring the city back on track. 5,800 units, 5,800 units were commissioned, half of which were actually landed in the estate of Pruitt-Igoe. High-rise district, 33 buildings, 11 stories, commissioned to the firm of Miguro Yamasaki, whom, of course, we know as the architect of another building. This man is arguably the most important architect in modern history, simply because he's been part of two major events in history. The end of modern architecture, and maybe the symbol of the ultimate loss of power of the West. But that little was known about it then. Actually, the construction of the World Trade Center, I think, was completed in the same year as Pruitt-Igoe was demolished. So, a typically modernist housing plan, 33 slabs of 11 stories, containing 12,000 residents. Development very confidently marketed and very popular at the time. I think that even during the design stage in 1951, Architectural Forum wrote a very raving article about it. Original features as skip-stop elevators, galleries on every third floor, of course a typical Pruitt-Igoe is named after two people, a black man and a white man. Wendell O. Pruitt, a former Army officer from the war, and William Igoe, a former congressman. When Pruitt-Igoe was planned in 1950, it was planned as a segregated neighborhood. By the time it was completed in 1956, I believe the Supreme Court, in the case Brown versus the Board of Education, had ruled out racial segregation. So by the time the whole development was finished, it was actually a mixed neighborhood, of which you see the first signs in this image. The whole neighborhood took off, and it's important to stress that there was an initial period and a number of good years. I think an occupancy rate of 91% in 1957, an initial relatively successful cohabitation of black and white people, the typical modernist light, air, and sun rhetoric here in the bright new buildings on spacious ground. They can live with indoor plumbing, electric light, fresh plaster walls, and other conveniences that are to be expected in the 20th century. The film interviews a lot of residents, which actually, in a way, particularly for a large part, convey their happiness about being able to move in there. I think this woman calls it the penthouse for the poor, and as a particularly upgrading of the standards that people were living in. So far so good. But at the same time, as I said before, the Housing Act had been distinctly ambiguous, and another trend was trying to materialize. The trend of, in a way, cheap suburban homes engulfing cities. And even though the Supreme Court had ruled out racial segregation in 1954, this in a way reinstated racial segregation on a far larger territory where people could simply live their separate lives without violating any law or any Supreme Court's ruling. We all know the happy suburban family life, which was actually promoted also in the 1950s, actively promoted in TV series. Here's two happy women. I don't know which series this is, but I mean, they look happy. But in reality, the happy faces somehow come out of some kind of disturbing rhetoric. As you can also see in this footage from the old country of color moving grid. I think the goals may have been equal with the whites. Here's another one. Well, I just couldn't live beside them, and one of the main reasons was because of a white community. This is the place I intend to live. So it was thought to be over, but actually isn't over. And it was simply a larger territorial form of segregation that continued to persist, and of course had a major effect on the city of St. Louis in itself. The population in the 1950s, early 50s, which was 850,000 today, is 318,000 and has been steadily on the decline. The public housing program, of course, suffered a kind of exodus, an increasing vacancy rate, till, up until just prior to 1970, there was about 2,500 people left from the initial 12,000 people. So you can see this as a vandalized building. You can also see it as an abandoned building. It looks no different than any abandoned industrial estate that simply no longer has a tenant. But of course the two go hand in hand, the lack of social control, vandalism, and abandonment. The state of the estate became such that at some point it started to become an item on national television and become an item in the national press, which of course didn't help and created a further exodus. Architectural Forum, which had initially praised the development in 1951, in 1965 wrote an article retracting most of its earlier praise from 1951, where the same features which it had initially praised were then actually identified as a source of blame and as a source of danger. The case history of quoted, the government no longer has an open checkbook, which meant that maintenance, which was initially paid for by federal funds liberated through the Housing Act, had to be paid by the tenants themselves, which in a way was added to the rent, which made living there more expensive than actually buying in the suburbs. So the combination of ever poorer and ever fewer tenants eroded any financial base to keep maintenance in the block. And in 1969 there was a rent strike, where actually Pruitt Igoe and its short-lived momentum of a kind of civil rights movement based on protesting, let's say, on excessive rents. As tenants, we've got to draw a line and say no more. A petition was taken to City Hall. It was a short-lived moment of fame for the few residents that had remained. But in a way, it was too little, too late. And we know what happened since. And we're back on the same days that this little sequel started from, with a somewhat different story than most of the architectural history books attribute to the process. But that, in a way, is immaterial. And it's not about right or wrong. I think the relevance of this story becomes clear when you actually compare then the time of the story to what is there now. A shocking difference. What has remained of Pruitt Igoe is essentially a somewhat awkwardly located, inappropriate forest in the middle of the city. Well, that's what you would think. But it's actually an inappropriate forest located in an inappropriate void. Pruitt Igoe has been demolished, but also the city around it has disappeared. That hasn't been demolished, but it is kind of voluntarily gone. This is Pruitt Igoe on the left. Sparse buildings left, boarded up windows, a kind of an urban wasteland here in Pruitt Igoe to the right of the image. And of course, since it is downtown America, a church remains. But it's a church that no longer really has a community to cater to, but it's typically almost kind of surreal scene that, strangely enough, if you look at it, it could have been taken on the Russian countryside just as much as in an inner city American city. We need to fix St. Louis. That's a very recent statement, so that makes clear that the demolition of Pruitt Igoe by no way solved anything. Pruitt Igoe demolished homes, but meanwhile St. Louis today has the most rapid rise in homelessness of the country, and that is only the tip of the iceberg. Research indicates, and this particular documentary, The Hidden Homeless, indicates that the rate of homelessness is about 3 to 4 times the rate of homelessness captured in any official censuses. And they talk of an epidemic which clearly puts an enormous strain on the dwindling resources of the city. Pruitt Igoe was a nest of crime, but actually St. Louis today still ranks amongst the 10 most dangerous cities in the U.S. With a kind of a violent crime rate of about 1,800 per 100,000 residents. Crimes, here you see a map of crime, predominantly take place in the inner city area of St. Louis. Anything, that's a very funny graph, anything from assault to robbery, arson and shooting, and a whole range more. But interestingly, we now see another phenomenon, and this is terribly interesting. Crime, in the absence of a tax base, in the absence of sufficient funds and municipal taxes, crime actually becomes a source of revenue for the municipal government, because the police is trained to almost regard anything as a crime, from noise to unkept property, from not keeping your grass green to saggy pants. Anything is reason to give a massive fine in the hope to create revenue for the city, which is of course a very, very perverse twist. As a result, or maybe not as a result, I St. Louis has been awarded the IBM Smarter City Grant. IBM largely awards this grant because it is already involved with the city of St. Louis in a computing and data program on crime. So in a way, IBM is sponsoring itself by supposedly sponsoring the St. Louis Metropolitan Police. IBM, in a way with the mayor, has a program which is called the Moneyball approach, protecting the city, appointing a chief performance officer who has the supreme power, the digital power, to solve crime even before they occur.
I used to think my job was all about arrests, chasing bad guys. Now I see them work differently. We analyze crime data, spot patterns, and figure out where to send patrols. It's helped some U.S. cities have serious crime by 30%. By stopping it before it happens. Let's build a smart planet.
This is, of course, brings us to the smart city. And crime isn't the only thing that IBM deals with. It's very interesting. This is a page from the brochure of the Smart City brochure of IBM. Essentially, IBM deals with public safety, hardware for crime, healthcare, energy, education, and in other words, a whole series of tasks which we previously attributed to the public sector. And IBM isn't the only one. I mean, the smart city is a prominent theme with almost every technology and digital company you can possibly imagine. Microsoft, Cisco, Siemens, Oracle, you name it. Smart, smarter, smartest, soon to be all outsmarted by Google, I'm sure. These are their emphatic manifestos which they write on the city. Most of these companies have a very short history with the city, but it's in a way their new toy discovery. So I guess you have to excuse some of the somewhat naive language, which with a typically cynical architectural audience is always good. With more than 50% of those meeting the demand and measure of sort of leverage massive amounts of health and safety of their citizens. Climate change, rising energy prices, and technology advance are all forces that are reshaping the collective mindset of consumers. As the world's public migrator, the city leaders are pressed to resolve overcrowding, pollution, resource constraints, inadequate infrastructure, and the need for continuing economic growth. I mean, you can have your cake and eat it. It seems. But there is, of course, a different side to this. So this is actually one of our images where we simply analyzed what the three major players of the previous quotations actually deal with, or the supposed list of public tasks that they offer to address. But ironically, that is the same list that is increasingly subject to a shadow economy, where there is a kind of an erosion by corporate business of public tasks, and at the same time, of course, another erosion of people that just go about their business and don't really bother about any rules. IBM deals with healthcare, but the shadow economy also deals with healthcare. Energy is, of course, a smart business, but it's also a very dirty business. You get illegal oil from Nigeria. And this is not just a third world problem. Actually, the US features prominently with the largest black economy in the world. Basically, if you add all this stuff up, if the black market was a sovereign nation, it would be the world's largest economic superpower. They call this System D. D stands for the French word débrouillard. Économie de débrouillardise. The largest economy in the world, which is interesting because it means that if Pruitt-Igoe was a public endeavor and made by a public sector, the building is no longer there. But if all of this persists, also the public sector is no longer there. And what does that actually mean? This indeed accounts for 50% of global wealth. But on the other extreme, in 2030, the richest 1% of the population held 50% of global wealth. Missouri and St. Louis are no exception. In fact, they feature prominently. 5 Missouri billionaires make the Forbes 400 richest list. Most notably, Bush, from the Anheuser-Busch family, with an estimated worth of a number, I never know trillion or billion in American, but I'm sure it's a lot of money. Anheuser-Busch is what you call a beer billionaire. They are the owner of the typical St. Louis beer, but meanwhile they're the owner of virtually every sort of beer, a kind of beer monopolist. Their corporate headquarters looks suspiciously like a beer bottle. It's also in St. Louis. And it's very unfortunate. I mean, Pruitt-Igoe was demolished, but even in terms of postmodernism, plain Charles Jenks postmodernism, St. Louis got shortchanged. Anyway, an estimated worth of that company of around $71 billion. Just let's compare that to the budget of the city of St. Louis, and then you might be able to understand why they have to fine grasshopping excessively. The net value of a company like that is actually 541 times the annual budget the city of St. Louis can spend on public safety. So not only do we have urban flight, we also have a type of capital flight that over time will become a problem in sustaining any public system, even now recognized by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Wealth inequality may be a bigger problem in the US than income inequality. This, in a way, brings me onto a very prominent book that has been written recently, a very fashionable book from the French economist Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, Thomas Piketty. And the book makes a very interesting point. A point that is so simple that you wonder why nobody has spotted it before. Basically, the book spells the end of trickle-down economics. That as long as you have economic growth, it's all right to have very rich people, just as long as everyone is getting better. What it in a way compares, historically, is the return on labor vis-a-vis the return on capital. When the return on capital, financial return on capital, is larger than the return on labor, basically any hope of catching up for a normal individual is gone. Any hope of social mobility in society is gone. You can work all you want. You can have 4 jobs, 5 jobs. Asymmetry and inequality will only rise. And of course, signs of that are everywhere. The interesting thing is that he has analyzed this almost since the beginning of times, from the year 0 up to 2050. The top one is the curve of return on capital. The bottom one is the curve that shows the return on labor. And we see, when we zoom in, that in a way the 20th century was the only period where actually the return on labor was larger than the return on wealth. A very brief 20th century, somewhere from the beginning of the 20th century, stopping well before the end of the 20th century. It is no coincidence that all utopias, which I showed earlier, have something to do with this. Utopias for mass housing are made on the wave of the possibility of social mobility. Utopias, all these plans, in a way give shape to social mobility. If you project this on these time graphs, you see that with the exception of Ebenezer Howard, all of these utopias that I showed are firmly within this period. They more or less stop when Pruitt-Igoe presented itself, which is actually also the first moment that the two curves are starting to approach each other again. Pruitt-Igoe represents a trauma that has hit particularly the architectural profession itself are, because if seminal works before 1972 were plans, seminal works after 1972 are books. Where before 1972 we had perspective visions, in a way after 1972 we have reflections. And you can argue that the confidence of the architectural professionals heavily changing. Learning from Las Vegas and Delirious New York are both case studies of something that is already there. They do no longer profess a general form of knowledge how to tackle the future. So you see that essentially these books neatly fill the curve, and the majority of them also falls, which means that the whole moment of progressive architectural thinking about the city as a phenomenon is actually limited to the period where wealth was larger than capital, and therefore the city had an authentic engine to exist. If you zoom out, and that is a tragic thing, and if you start to look back to the beginning of times and further in the future, you see that this period is an anomaly. The period in which probably most of us, and particularly the members of the educational staff have been educated, is an anomaly. What we think is the norm, what we think is the way of the world, is actually, it might be nothing but a brief exception in history. I graduated in 1989, which means that was the moment the world started to change, which essentially means that anything I had before 1989 is essentially worthless. I don't know what that says about my involvement as a teacher here, but these are the exact dates. 1914, the beginning of World War I, 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall. They are actually the bracket of the period that I'm talking about, the period Piketty is talking about. That means from the shock in Sarajevo to the fall of the Berlin Wall. The most important architectural manifesto that was written after in 1914 was the Futurist Manifesto by Marinetti, published in the Figaro. The Architectural Manifesto of 1989 is a vision of Britain by Prince Charles. The uniform of Franz Ferdinand, the blood-stained uniform of Franz Ferdinand from 1949 finds its counterpart in the ornamented red jacket of actually British royalty. What is this period? I mean, is it essentially something that never happened? Can we simply get rid of it and just get on with it in a way like the 20th century never happened? Both men, incidentally, are great fans of hunting. This is a kind of interesting collision. The end of aristocracy and the reinstatement of aristocracy. From the Belvedere Palace of the Archduke of the Austrian Habsburg, the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy, to Buckingham Palace, the residence of Charles. Utopia, between 1949 and 1989, is a brief period in history where we were allowed to think. Before that, we have feudalism. What will we have after? That is the main question. Where do we go from here? Corbusier's visions, utopian, and a kind of post-utopian vision. The similarity is in a way eerie, because it looks like we have nothing to worry about. I mean, apart from a slightly more varied skyline, it's still the same typology of high-rise, it's still a grid city, and it seems modernism continues. But there is one very important difference between this image and the image before, and that this image is not made by architects. It is actually the cover of a McKinsey report. A McKinsey report where McKinsey is actually posing as an urban planner, and far more than that, proposing to fix the future of Mumbai. Mumbai, with its, and it's the same grandiose rhetoric as in the case of the smart city. Mumbai, with its seemingly unsurmountable problems, can transform itself into a world-class city in a 10 to 15-year time frame. This report aims to show the way for Mumbai just to do that. This is Mumbai, and probably the way to do that is by doing this. Turning a blind eye to everything that does not conform to this vision. This is a more detailed part of the report. It measures the performance. It no longer deals with form, it deals with the performance of the city in a number of definable categories. Most notably these four. which are exactly the categories by which international lists measure the standing of cities. This is the Economist Intelligence Unit used to determine expat salaries with its most important criteria, where cities are rated, and in a way cities' global competitiveness is done. So rather than planning, it becomes a form of measuring, indexing the city with a number of performance criteria so that we creep up these lists. Now, if you see what's at the top of this list, Vancouver, Melbourne, I mean, you really wonder whether you want to be up there. But it's a typical Anglo-Saxon model that prevails. The list has a top 10. The list also has a bottom 10. Actually, far more interesting cities. But cities which, of course, all deal with contemporary problems. The whole discussion about the megacity, in my view, is actually a discussion about growth of people and growth of GDP. When the growth of people actually outperforms the growth of economic wealth, there is a kind of a shortfall, which means that the more we aspire to this, the more we aspire to a shiny image of the city, the more inevitably we get this in tandem. They're part of the same package. Prue and Igoe, maybe the 50s and the 60s, were about rich and poor. The poor were there, the poor existed, the poor were dealt with, and that may in parts explain why an essentially benign ideology, or in essence, turns the tent, has such a brutalist kind of appearance. Today, we have a different phenomenon. We have the included and the excluded, the formal and the shadow economy, the legal and the illegal. And there's one nice thing about the illegal, that you can pretend they don't exist. You can create perfection, not by effort, not by creation, but by editing out. This is Rio. This is Panama. I think this is somewhere on the US-Mexican border, and it's very interesting. This is the Berlin Wall again. And it's very interesting that even though in 1989 this wall was torn down, the wall between two opposing political ideological system has somehow spun the existence of a whole series of other walls which are far more pressing and far more difficult to deal with. I should have included another image from the Venice Biennale. It's a very beautiful set of photographs taken in the 70s from Pyongyang and Seoul. And the curator did a test on me trying to say which one is which in the 1970s, and I failed in almost every single instance. Although there were walls, there was a remarkable similarity and a remarkable similar version of the same offense. These walls hide extremely different conditions. There's a very beautiful quote from Jean Baudrillard. It likens the existence on the American highways to the poor, to the person who knows the American freeways. Their signs read like a litany. Right lane must exit. This must exit has always struck me as a sign of destiny. I've got to go. I've got to expel myself from this paradise, needless providential highway, which leads nowhere, but which keeps me in touch with everyone. This is the only real society of warmth here. This collective compulsion of limbs, plunging suicidally, he's French, I'm sorry, together. Why should I tear myself away to revert to an individual trajectory in a vain sense of responsibility? Then later on in the book, if America is resuscitated, then the massacre of the Indians didn't happen. Vietnam didn't happen. It knows only the self-evidence of wealth, the tautology of power, which it magnifies to the dimensions of the nation, or indeed the whole world. The have-nots will be condemned to oblivion, to abandonment, to disappearance, pure and simple. This must exit logic, referring back to the freeway. Poor people must exit. The ultimatum, issued in the name of wealth and efficiency, wipes them off the map, and rightly so, since they show such bad taste as to deviate from the general consensus. This is the world's most livable cities index, plain and simple, predicted at the end of the 80s. So last weekend, and then I'll stop. Last weekend was a celebration of the fall of the Berlin Wall. We have a very interesting way of seeing the world in that time frame. This is the world in 1989, divided into two blocks. We can call them democratic and non-democratic, but it's essentially part of the world where you have elections, part of the world where you don't have elections. The thing you don't choose your rulers. Since 1989, we always assumed that by the fall of the world, the amount of blue would increase at the expense of the red. But something else has happened. There's a third category that has presented itself. Now, in the blue part, you have elections. In the red part, you don't have elections. In the yellow part, you have elections, but you know the outcome in advance. It's an increasingly successful system of managed democracy, which is actually strangely liked as a condition to work in by modern architects. The battle between the red and the blue will increasingly be fought not over human rights, but over efficiency. This is a terribly interesting thing. This is Heathrow Terminal 5, and a lengthy complaint article, how long it took to build it, how quick it would have been in China, etc., etc., etc. Foster, about this, I think it's him who's quoted in the article. We're in a state of denial while they, the Chinese, are making decisions in the spirit of the Victorians. They have the courage to try it. Victorians, pre-1914 or pre-whatever. 20th century did not happen. What attracts me about China is that there is still a state. There is something that can take initiative on a scale and a nature that almost nobody that we know today could ever afford or contemplate. You don't know who that is? The more centralized the power, the less compromises need to be made in architecture. The directions are clear. Peter Eisenman in the New York Times. Democracy, obviously, is something we don't want to give up, but it does create chaos. It means the guy next door can do whatever he wants. It creates a collision of thinking. In cities, that means people build whatever they want. Frank Gehry, 2007 Foreign Policy. Some of the most amazing places were built because of dictators. Architecture is always related to power and related to large interests, whether financial or political. Bernard Tschumi. This is priceless. I think the best thing to have for us is a benevolent dictator who has taste. I'm not sure about the extent of irony, if any, in this statement. But I wonder what it means. I wonder what it means if the kind of usual suspects, in a way, have their way. When you could argue that rhetoric like this doesn't lead to the triumph of the blue, but actually favors the yellow, as a very persuasive means of the red to give up its dictatorship, because it doesn't have to become blue, it can become yellow. But at the same time, it's also a very potent political system that erodes the blue and makes it very tempting for the blue to give up some of its democratic principles. So I don't know whether all the future of the world will be yellow, and I don't know whether that will still amount to a yes. Thank you very much. In the spirit of the last quotes, I'm not really prepared to take any questions. I'll take questions.
Sorry, typically you work in places that are yellow?
And I mean, we are part of exactly the same criticism.
Do the people who are making decisions on those projects, do they see the same type of divide between, you were chopping away half of the slides that you were showing. Do they see those two systems as not being connected? Because, having done some research in Mumbai, you can see that they're actually totally intertwined in ways that are quite fascinating, but no one really talks about. The informal and the informal, the black and the open, etc. And is that acknowledged by people who make decisions?
Well, I think it's acknowledged there, but the problem arises that globalization is a very strange phenomenon because it, on the one hand, relies on the import of a certain preconceived truth, as is the case in the McKinsey report, and on the other hand, of course, relies enormously of tapping into local knowledge. And it's often a neck and neck race between those two things as well. You know, between this is what I try to show as a world of crude generalizations that underlie a lot of these crude economic systems. And it's strange that, of course, locally that was totally not recognized. But once one locality has to talk to another, you kind of end up at a lowest common denominator, at a kind of a synchronized language where these lists and these criteria are almost the only tool you have to talk globally, even if every local situation is, of course, far more subtle than I've shown here. And also, I have to say, I have never worked in a place where people did not consider themselves democratic. So in that sense, there's no mea culpa. But I guess, yeah, also the DDR considered itself democratic. But I mean, democracy, and that is the thing that we can convey from personal experience. Democracy is becoming increasingly a matter of simulation. You simulate democratic procedures because it allows you to, in a way, operate on the basis of a logic familiar to other places in the world. So the democratic procedures become a way of economic synchronizations, but it doesn't mean the outcome of decisions is necessarily fair. It's often fixed in advance.
I think you just gave a great critique of all those smart cities and things that you just talked about. Thanks.
That was incredibly concise, so it's hard to come to the question so quickly. But the only, I guess, benevolent dictatorship I could think of is perhaps Brunei, where since, I think, 1999, their economy grows like 50% every year, which is insane.
But do they have taste?
That's part of my question, is actually that you don't really see foreign architects doing much there. I don't think anything really.
I have no experience with the place whatsoever.
Okay, so I guess I would reframe the question as, can you come up with any places like that are sort of devoid of their influence? I mean, is that the only example that you know of? I guess.
What do you mean?
Of someone in control who is not, I guess, ruining everything.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't think that. I mean, this is not to say that you know, China is bad or Timor is bad. It's not. I mean, I'm saying it actually relatively in the absence of a verdict on these places, because I mean there are different systems, and often, of course, a lot of the red, they still have a significant public sector. So ironically, they take care of the people who are not well off a lot better than the blue. So I don't think it's that black and white. I mean, in my experience, also those systems have their own inefficiency. Because I mean, there is something about totalitarianism that is equally inefficient as to consensus. I mean, basically everywhere is inefficient, which is a reassuring thought, I guess.
It seems to me this is sort of a breaking moment as the inequality trap diverges, as opposed to the moment when it was parallel. It's either or, and now we have a moment where if we responsible parties make good examples or produce a good example, then we may have a future of diversity and
Yeah, but I think it's not that simple, because a building used to be a means to an end. In the time of functionalism, you made a building to perform the function that it was supposed to perform. Today, the real function of a building is in a way to generate larger revenue and capital. I mean, by far, I think 80% of all buildings that get built, you know, libraries and public provisions excluded, but 80% of all business that get built is simply an investment in stone in a time that actually interest rates and return on capital in the bank is low. To in a way maximize that revenue. So the real function of a building is actually to contribute to the divergence of the graph in the wrong direction. So therefore it always, since as an architect you make buildings, since politically the role of a building and economically the role of a building has changed so much, as soon as you build, you are almost by definition complicit in that system. And that's where I think it is almost inevitable that architecture at one point has to become political. Because if you simply do your job, and your job is calibrated in such a way that it contributes to something you don't want it to contribute to, no matter how beautiful, no matter how good. Because in the other hand, an architect is also just a person that works, and the fruits of his work can never, and the fruits of his labor can never catch up. But if I compare the fees of our buildings compared to the revenue that these buildings make, it is insane. We talk about budget cuts on the facades of buildings, and at the moment the buildings get ready, you see a tenant list. I mean, this is a project in the centre of London. You see a tenant list with some of the richest people in the world. And you see tenants list with people who buy Chelsea Football Club, from their back pocket, etc. And at the same time, you discuss budget cuts on the cheapest ventilation system in windows. And in that sense, there is a remarkable situation at play that almost becomes inescapable.
So you're saying on the blue part of the world we build for
No, but in the red part of the world we also build.
Yes,
for money. And in the yellow part also. So that is a generalizing statement that all happens almost irrespective. And also the wealth inequality of Piketty's graph also happens irrespective of the blue, yellow, red, because once you subtract capital at such a massive scale from the system, even if you are democratic, you become marginal because the amount of public funds you control through democracy is so marginal vis-a-vis all the wealth that is there. And that is in a way the point of the last slide, that it's become a farce almost everywhere. So I don't know whether that answers your question or...
I know that in the yellow part of the world, architects don't have big impact because more than 80 or 90% of things are built by other people than architects. Is there a way architects can have an impact there without being policymakers or being in politics?
I'm not sure, because I also think in the blue part by now the percentage of buildings built by non-architects is very large, and I don't know what you can do to make an impact if who is making buildings and those buildings are on that side of the line. I think maybe in a small way you can choose to be aware and wait for the moment that there is something to do. I mean, it's a very dark story. I'm sorry for a Wednesday evening.
Sorry, I love the graphic. We have been puzzling with on one hand. At the beginning, I kept thinking, what about all those other utopias that came before that one? Go to Plato, go to the New Jerusalem. And then I think so much of that was based on, in fact, that particular form of concentration of wealth was all based on agricultural production, primarily. So land and controlling land. So you have one kind of utopia beforehand. But the thing you're describing now is based on a whole different sort of wealth. I guess I'm trying to...
I know
there's no happy ending here, but I'm trying to find
happy
the
ending.
dystopia, the utopias, and then we're talking about what? The dystopia.
Yeah, you always, literature and film and theater and anything, any sort of art form is in my view, always more profound when it doesn't have a happy ending. But it's maybe a very European view. And of course, there is some tactical choice of utopias to actually fit in the Piketty. I will not deny that. But I do think that the utopias we're talking about here are utopias which endeavor to deal with mass housing, which endeavor to deal with very large numbers of people who needed a kind of an existenzminimum. I mean, in that sense, it's different from some of the Idealstädte of medieval times. I mean, I've deliberately looked at the ones that somehow dealt with mass housing of an industrialized population. And that seems to coincide. But I don't know whether there's happy ending. I certainly don't think the smart city, and I think there's something deeply tragic about the smart city, because it is done by people who have a very short history with the city, therefore often have a rhetoric of enormous naivete, a kind of a self-overestimation of how they can fix problems that we know will take a lot longer to fix. But the irritating thing is that it's a very clever ploy, because by calling it smart, they condemn everything we did as being stupid. So it's certainly no happy ending for us.
Couldn't the first smart city be the Detroit and RoboCop? So that's somewhere right about that.
Yeah. When was that? That was 80s. That was Paul Verhoeven. Yeah. A Dutch director. Right, it's completely irrelevant.
I have a question about the yellow map.
Where are
So, do you think if the world slowly turns into the yellow and the red, it provides more opportunities for architects?
you? There's a question mark. But if all the world will turn yellow, I think there are more pressing problems than the opportunities for architects, to be frank.
I mean, that makes sense, but...
And that's the tragic thing. Architects always look for opportunities. They're incurable optimists. That, as long as they can do a nice building in the most deeply flawed, fucked up system, they're happy as long as they're on the cover of a magazine. And myself included.
I have a question. I think it's very interesting, and it amazes me often when, especially at this time, China's coming to the center side of the world, and there are a lot of Western architects have their buildings built in China. And I think that's really interesting, because since the beginning of 2000, we have the Remco has the CCTV, and especially after 2008, the Olympic Games, we have Herzog and Moran and Norman Foster, and all that Western architecture start to almost invade into the Chinese culture. I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. Until
I
recently.
think the President's speech kind of put an end to that.
Yes. Yes. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, to be honest.
I think it's, we completely agree with the President.
I guess my question is more related to what your stance is towards modernism, how you think of the modernism works within the city of, under totally different cultural backgrounds.
I'm very ambiguous about it, because it's clear that the utopias and then the certain innocence, and I guess had an enormously damaging and destructive effect in parts. And that's evident, but precisely because that's evident, it also neutralizes it. And I seriously wonder that clearly an overdose of utopianism can be dangerous. A huge body count can be attached to it. But my open question is whether, if the course of history is dialectic, then what follows is an outright rejection of utopian thinking, and in the wake of that, a rejection of independent thinking at all. And I simply think that those dynamics have an entire danger of their own. And by focusing so much on the faults of modernism, I think we are not being aware of that meanwhile a completely opposite danger is due to the equation. So I generally in talks and exhibitions deliberately relish that period, but I also relish it because I know it is over and it is a kind of antibiotics into a present day illness. So it's a kind of propaganda by choice, while knowing, of course, that it certainly wasn't without flaws. And it's particularly a kind of foresight and hindsight that becomes interesting.
So can I ask?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
So what's OMA or AMO's next step regarding to Chinese market after the president's speech?
Business as usual. Because I mean the type of I think the type of buildings we have been building on the CCTV, the type of architectural projects we've been doing on the CCTV already have a revisionist element inside them, where they are far more restrained, where they are far more aware of not appearing wasteful in such a society. Unfortunately, it's a trend that we already started a long time ago, but of course our biggest building continues to be a most prominent feature, and etc. But I mean, we have long embarked on a trajectory of a certain amount of subtlety in terms of architecture to China, and we hope we can continue that.
So a question has to do with informality, and so a lot of these governments, are trying to deal with the informal housing situation we have, and then we have a return of buildings like Periodigo, especially in cities that end up just fading. You have examples in Angola where you have architects from China trying to develop these cities, and then they just don't end up working. So I guess I'm wondering how you think these cities can address the infrastructural needs for the informal settlements. Is it more than just architecture? Is it an investment in transportation?
I think it's an infrastructural question, because it's interesting, and we had this discussion the past few days. If you look at the UN definition of what constitutes a slum, that definition doesn't talk about architecture. That doesn't even talk about building quality. That definition talks exclusively about the access to infrastructure, roads, water, sanitation, public provisions, etc., 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 which seems to suggest that anything can become a slum and anything can stop being a slum once that element is fixed, which also means that, in my view, the whole thing becomes an urbanistic question, where urbanism and infrastructure start to mingle with each other, and that therefore it's very important to stop looking at it as an architectural question. I mean, there are buildings in Moscow which were built under communism, which were not slums, because they qualify in terms of they tick all boxes. But meanwhile, they're so overpopulated that in a way the infrastructure and access to facilities really fall short. So that's when also established buildings that are not shanty towns can become slums. And I'm sure conversely, a certain amount of equipping with infrastructure to informal development also stop them from being slums. And I think there are signs in both directions.
I guess this question is a little bit more advice from you. So, disregarding the shadow market you talked about, the roughly 1,500 billionaires there are control actually about half of that, about 25%. Would you advise the young architects of the day to join the Lions or to try to hunt them?
The thing there is that, I mean, what I try to show is that, so there is a certain amount of capital concentrated in the super rich, and there is an increasing amount of capital concentrated in the illegal. Now, one type of capital can be very easily unlocked, because it is subject, the more capital is in fewer hands, the more it is subject to a kind of single-handed decision power. But I think as the shadow economy gets bigger and bigger, and as the numbers there accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, I think it becomes inevitable that at some form that class is going to get a manifesto, that at some form that class is going to get a political script, that at some form the amount of wealth going to be mobilized. I mean, the tragedy of black money is you can't do anything with it until the amount of money simply outnumbers the official money. And in that sense, I think we're at a very important moment that I don't know what will happen politically. But as an architect, I think it's, I mean, we have a typical advantage that we make our living by engaging. I mean, if you're a journalist, if you're an artist, if you're a writer, I mean, you have the freedom to observe and pass judgment. I mean, whenever we pass judgment, we often pass judgment about ourselves. But we have a knowledge, which is typically a knowledge from within, because we always have to engage, because that's what we do. We also, I do feel we have a certain amount of multiplied experiential knowledge that in a way is priceless and often also surpasses the knowledge of writers, journalists, etc., etc., etc. So, to that extent, I think a certain amount of omnivoricness and a certain amount of front-runnerish coupled to an astute awareness is the best thing to do. And we generally always assess things on a case-by-case basis. You know, that means we turn down projects in the context of bad regimes, but we also turn down bad projects supposedly done in the name of good regimes. I mean, it varies, and I think that's also quite healthy, because I mean, as soon as your judgment becomes categorical, you also stop thinking. So my advice would be to simply keep your eyes open. Okay, can we go for a drink?